Fala pessoal, tudo bem? Sejam bem-vindos a mais um novo vídeo aqui no canal. Espero que vocês gostem da história de hoje. Não se esqueçam de curtir, compartilhar e comentar. O mais importante para nós aqui é que vocês se inscrevam e comentem o feedback de vocês aqui abaixo nos comentários. E é isso, sem mais delongas, fiquem com a história. Valeu!
My mother-in-law stabbed my baby shower cake 47 times, screaming, "You ruined my life," and lunged at my stomach with the knife. My husband supported her, but my own mother grabbed my arms and held me still. I'm due in 5 weeks, and she has a key to my house. My mother-in-law stabbed my baby shower cake 47 times with a serving knife and then lunged at my stomach. My husband's response, standing 4 feet away, was to say, "Mom, stop, come on," in the same tone you'd use if she'd knocked over a cup. Those two things happened in the same 30 seconds, in my own living room, and I have not been able to put them back in any order that makes sense. I'm going to try to explain how we got there. The cake was rosemary buttercream, from a bakery I drove 40 minutes to use, because I have a rosemary plant on my kitchen windowsill that I've been tending since we moved in, and I thought it was funny to carry the joke into the party. Nobody got that reference. That's fine. I knew what it meant. It was a Saturday in early October, the kind of afternoon where the light comes in sideways and makes everything look warmer than it is, and I was 31 weeks pregnant and wearing a dress I'd ordered specifically for this event, and I was genuinely, actually happy for about 2 hours. The living room was too small for the number of people in it. There were mylar balloons in pink that kept drifting into the ceiling fan. My friend from work had made a playlist that was slightly too loud. Dolores, my mother-in-law, had been quiet in a particular way since she arrived. The kind of quiet that has a temperature, but I had been watching her be that specific kind of quiet for 18 months, and I had learned to read it as baseline rather than warning. That was my first mistake of the day. The second was not registering. When someone asked about the baby's name, the name Craig and I had chosen together, that I loved, that we had not yet told Dolores, that the sharp intake of breath from the corner of the room meant something was starting rather than something was being absorbed. She said the name back, once, quietly, like she was tasting it. And then she picked up the cake knife, and she went at the cake. I counted 47 later because the detective who photographed the kitchen told me. In the room, I couldn't count. I was watching the knife go up and down, and I was watching my husband take one step toward her and stop, and I was thinking very clearly, the way you think clearly when your body has fully understood something your mind is still negotiating, that the knife was not staying in the cake. When she turned toward me, I stepped back. I stepped into my mother's hands. Both of my mother's hands closed around my forearms from behind and held. I looked at my husband. He was looking at his mother. That's the part I keep returning to. Not the knife, the direction of his eyes. We moved into the house 18 months before the shower. It was a rental, 3 bedrooms, with a kitchen that faced east and got good morning light before the neighbor's oak tree blocked it around 10. The first weekend we were there, I went to the farmer's market 4 blocks away and bought a rosemary plant in a 4-inch pot for $3. I put it on the kitchen windowsill in the east-facing window, and it didn't die. That was the whole achievement. I work with elderly clients. I help them through their daily routines. I manage their paperwork. I notice the things they can no longer say clearly and write them down so someone else can act on them, and I come home from that work carrying a lot of other people's needs. The rosemary didn't need anything much. It needed water twice a week, and occasional sunlight and me to pinch off the woody stems when they got too stiff. I found I liked doing that. I'd stand at the sink rubbing a leaf between my fingers while I thought about something else, and the smell would cut through whatever I was turning over. Anyway. Craig and I had been together 4 years when we moved in. He was attentive in specific ways that felt real. He remembered that I hate overhead lighting and would turn on the lamp before I walked in the room. He drove my client's county paperwork to the drop-off office on his lunch break because I mentioned once that the parking was terrible. He is not a cartoon villain. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters for understanding how we got so far down a road before I really looked up. The Dolores situation had always been a thing, the way a lot of people have a mother-in-law thing. She had opinions about the house. She called Craig at hours that seemed designed for maximum interruption. She cried when we told her I was pregnant. I assumed they were happy tears. I was happy, and I wanted her to be too, and so I looked at what I needed to see and filed the rest. That's an honest accounting of my part in the early months. The thing about telling yourself a story where someone is just anxious, just old-fashioned, just devoted, is that it works right up until it doesn't. I didn't know yet that Dolores had said things to Craig in the years before me that I won't know the full shape of until much later. I didn't know yet that he had been managing her in a specific way for his entire adult life, which meant he had also learned a specific way of not seeing things he didn't want to deal with. That's context, not an excuse. At 18 months out, all I knew was that the Rosemary was doing well. Craig turned on the lamp before I walked in the room, and something in the back of my mind was labeled but not yet opened. 6 months before the shower, Dolores started coming on Tuesdays. She had a key. Craig had given it to her before I moved in, for emergencies, and the conversation about whether that was still necessary had come up once, and then dissolved the way those conversations do when one person in the couple doesn't actually want to have it. I'd come home from a long shift to find the kitchen rearranged. Not dramatically, just the dish rack moved to the other side of the sink, the mugs turned so their handles faced a different direction. Small enough that I second-guessed myself the first 2 times. The third time, the rosemary plant was gone from its windowsill. I found it on the sill above the opposite counter, the west-facing one, further from the sink and catching the afternoon light instead of the morning. I put it back. Craig came home and I mentioned it and he said, "Better light probably." He said it without looking up from his phone. He wasn't being dismissive on purpose. He genuinely believed that sentence was an explanation. That's the thing I keep trying to explain to people when they ask about Craig, because he knew and did nothing is simpler than the truth, which is that he had a very specific way of recasting anything his mother did as reasonable or well-intentioned, and he'd been doing it for so long that it wasn't even conscious anymore. It was just his first language. Anyway, the visits continued. She brought food, usually something I didn't ask for, and Craig loved as a child. She reorganized the pantry once. She left a note on the counter once that said, "Toilet paper goes under, not over, it's less wasteful." And I stood there reading it for a solid minute trying to decide what category of thing that was. During one visit I was home. I'd left work early with a headache, and Dolores didn't hear me come in. I stood in the hallway and listened to her moving around in the kitchen, and I heard her say, to no one, or maybe to herself, "This isn't how it should be arranged." She didn't mean the kitchen. I don't know how I knew that. I just did. Around this time, she said something during a visit that I've thought about a lot since. She was looking at my stomach. I was maybe 20 weeks, just starting to show clearly, and she said, "Craig was such an easy baby. He never caused me a moment of trouble until..." And she stopped. I said, "Until what?" She smiled and said, "Oh, growing up." I told Craig that night. He said, "She means until I moved out, I guess. She had a hard time with that." I wrote it down when he went to sleep. Not dramatically. I'd started keeping a notebook around this time, the same kind I use for client logs at work, a plain black one, narrow-ruled. I wrote down the date, what she said, and what Craig said when I told him. I wasn't building anything yet. I was just doing what I do when things don't add up. I write them down because memory is unreliable under stress, and I've learned that the hard way through other people's lives. When someone shows you who they are and the person next to you says, "That's just how she is," pay attention to both of them. I loved Craig, so I tried to believe him. I should have paid attention to both of them. 3 months before the shower, I started taking photographs. Not of anything dramatic of the kitchen after Dolores had been there, the pantry shelves, the windowsill where the rosemary kept migrating back and forth depending on who got to it last. My phone has timestamps on every image, and I knew from work that timestamps are the thing that makes a record rather than just a complaint. I told myself I was being careful. I think I was also scared, and this was the only form that took. One morning I was in the kitchen making coffee before my first client visit, and Craig's phone buzzed on the counter. I wasn't looking at it deliberately. I just saw the name and a fragment of the preview text Dolores, and something about the baby's room before the screen went dark. I stood there for a moment. I want to be honest about what I did next. I didn't pick up the phone. I thought about it. I stood there with my coffee, and I made a deliberate decision that I was not going to be the person who went through her husband's phone, because I didn't want to find something, and I didn't want to become someone who snooped. And also because I knew, in some practical corner of my brain, that anything I found that way would be harder to use and easier to dismiss. So I didn't touch it. I wrote down the date, and Dolores text free baby's room in the notebook, and I went to work. What I did instead was go through my own email. Every thread I'd ever been copied on that included Dolores. Birthday logistics, holiday schedules, the home purchase paperwork. I was looking for, I don't know what exactly pattern, I think. I found a thread from 8 months before the pregnancy announcement. Craig had started it, something about Thanksgiving plans, and Dolores had replied with a paragraph that ended, "I just need to know you'll always put me first, sweetheart. No matter what changes." Craig had replied reassurances, several sentences, warm and specific. I had been CC'd on the original email by accident. I was removed from all subsequent replies. I only had the first 2 messages. It was enough. I sat with that for a few days. Then I found the note. I'd been going through my bedside drawer prenatal paperwork, the stack of it that accumulates when you're someone who keeps every document, and under a folder I'd left there for months was a folded piece of paper in Dolores's handwriting. It said, "This room will need to change when the baby comes. I have some ideas. We should talk without Craig." She had been in our bedroom. She had gone into my bedside drawer, or near enough to it, during one of her Tuesday visits. I photographed the note in place before I touched it. I put it back exactly where I found it. I didn't tell Craig. I was past the point of telling Craig things and waiting to see what shape they came back as. A week later, my neighbor stopped me at the mailbox and asked, genuinely curious, whether Craig's mother was staying with us, because she saw her car every Tuesday. I said no, just visits. My neighbor said she'd seen Dolores in the backyard once, walking the fence line slowly. Like she was measuring something, she said. I wrote that down too. 2 weeks before the shower, I told Craig I had a midwife appointment moved up and came home early on a Tuesday. I didn't have a midwife appointment. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters. I'm not proud of the small deception, but I'm also not going to dress it up as strategy. I was scared and I wanted to see what was happening in my house when I wasn't supposed to be there. And that's the whole truth of it. Dolores's car was in the driveway. I let myself in through the back door and stood in the kitchen for a moment. I could hear her moving around upstairs. I followed the sound to the baby's room, which Craig and I had been setting up slowly on weekends. The crib I'd assembled myself on a Saturday while he was out watching his friend's band play, the small dresser we'd painted a pale yellow, the mobile I'd ordered and then reconsidered and then ordered again. The door was half open. I stood in the hallway and I took out my phone and I pressed record before I looked around the corner. What I saw was Dolores smoothing a blanket over the crib mattress. The crib was against a different wall than I'd put it. She was murmuring something I couldn't quite catch, and then I could, "There you go. There you go, sweetheart." And then, a little quieter, almost to herself, "My baby's room." She said it the way you say something that's already true. Not a wish, a fact. She turned around and saw me in the doorway, and she didn't look guilty. That was the thing that stayed with me. She looked mildly surprised, the way you look when someone comes home earlier than expected. Not the way you look when you've been caught doing something wrong. She said, "Oh, I thought you had an appointment." I said I got out early. I kept the phone in my hand, screen down. She didn't ask about it. What followed was about 8 minutes of the most clarifying conversation I have ever had. She didn't apologize for moving the crib. She explained. The baby was going to be her second chance, she said. At what? I asked. At the closeness she'd had with Craig before things changed. I said, "What changed?" She looked at me in a way that answered the question without using my name. She had been patient, she said. She had tried to adjust. But I needed to understand that Craig was her son first, and that this baby was going to need a grandmother who was present in a real way, not a visitor. And she had some ideas about how the room should be set up that she thought we should discuss. I kept my voice even. I am good at keeping my voice even when I am terrified. It is a professional skill I did not expect to need in my own home. I said I appreciated her sharing that. I said we'd talk more soon. She left 20 minutes later. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not the couch. The floor. I don't know why, and I listened to the recording twice. Then I found the contact I'd saved in my phone 3 months earlier under the name Dentist, and I called it. My attorney answered on the second ring. I told her what I had. She told me the recording was usable in a civil proceeding. The key was another matter. "You can have the locks changed," she said, "but you need to be prepared for what that starts." I said I thought I was already in the middle of what it starts. She said, yes, probably. The police came to the house that night. Dolores had already been taken to a relative's, someone on Craig's side I've met twice, because she was the word Craig used was distressed. The officer who took my statement was patient and thorough and photographed the cake and the knife and the table and wrote down the count, 47 punctures in the cake, one in the tablecloth beneath it. I gave my written account that night while everything was still exact in my memory. I have the report number. I have always had the report number. Craig came back from wherever he'd gone with Dolores. I don't actually know where they went in those first 2 hours. I was giving a statement and then sitting with the 2 guests who stayed, and his first extended conversation with me was not about the knife. He said his mother was devastated by her own behavior. He said she'd been under enormous stress. He said the word emotional 3 times in 4 minutes, which I know because I was counting the way you count things when you are very calm on the outside and something is happening on the inside that you don't have a name for yet. Then he said, and I want to be precise here because I wrote it down verbatim as soon as he left the room, she didn't make contact. I underlined it twice. He genuinely believed that was a relevant distinction, that the lunge was a separate category of event from the stabbing because the knife hadn't reached me. I have thought about that sentence a lot in the weeks since, and I think it tells you everything about how Craig's mind had learned to work around his mother, always finding the frame that reduced the severity by 1 degree, always landing just short of having to say the thing out loud. 2 days later, he sent me a screenshot of a text from Dolores. 2 sentences. Clearly drafted by someone else, possibly by Craig himself. The phrasing was too clean, too absent of her actual cadence. He sent it with a message that said, "She's really trying. I think we can get through this." He meant it. That's the part that took me a while to stop being angry about and start being sad about. He genuinely believed a 2-sentence text was a thing that could contain what had happened, that we were in a conflict that could be resolved with enough goodwill and time. Around the same time, a woman I'd considered a friend, someone I'd known through Craig's family, someone who had been at the shower and watched what happened, texted me to say she got both sides, that Dolores had always been so devoted, that maybe I should consider how hard it is to be a mother-in-law when you feel left out. I read it once. I took a screenshot. I added it to the file. I blocked her number. I felt no particular drama about any of those 4 steps. They followed each other, the way practical things do when you've already decided what you're doing. Dolores still had the key. Craig had not asked for it back. He had not suggested he would. I started sleeping with my phone on the nightstand at full charge, volume on high, because I was 31 weeks pregnant and alone in a specific way that had nothing to do with whether my husband was lying next to me. Craig went to his mother's on a Wednesday evening, just to check on her, and I sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me and cried for the first time since the shower. Not from self-pity, or not only from that. From the specific grief of understanding that the 2 people who were supposed to be between me and harm had both stepped aside at the same moment, one toward his mother, and one, my own mother, toward what she'd decided was the safer management of the room. I had not cried at the shower. I had not cried when I gave the police statement. I had not cried when Craig said she didn't make contact. I cried now, alone, at my kitchen table, 32 weeks pregnant, with a notebook full of dates and exact quotes and time-stamped photographs, and the crying was ugly and not particularly cathartic, and after about 15 minutes, I blew my nose and sat there. Then my mother called. The conversation was the second worst of the month. She had been thinking, she said. She wanted me to understand her thinking. She'd grabbed my arms because she was afraid Dolores would escalate further if I moved toward her. She was trying to de-escalate, trying to protect everyone in the room, making a split-second decision under stress. She said, "I was protecting you." I let her finish. Then I said very quietly, because I didn't have the energy for volume, "You held my arms while a woman lunged at my stomach with a knife. I need you to understand that sentence before we talk again." There was a long silence. She said my name. I said goodnight and I hung up. She didn't call back that night. I put the phone face down on the table and sat with it for a while. Here's the thing about my mother that I haven't figured out how to resolve. She is not malicious. She genuinely believed she was helping. That is somehow harder to deal with than if she'd just been wrong in a simpler way, because there's nothing to push against, just this wall of good intention that got the most important thing completely, catastrophically backwards. Anyway, after the phone call, I did something petty. I'm going to tell it plainly because it's part of the story, and I think pretending I was dignified throughout would be dishonest. I went to the kitchen windowsill. Dolores had repositioned the rosemary plant to the west-facing window again at some point during her last visit, and it was sitting there catching the afternoon light she preferred. I moved it back to the east window, where I'd put it 18 months ago, where it got the morning light. And then I watered it just under what it needed. Not enough to kill it. Enough to keep it slightly stressed, the leaves a shade less vivid, the stems a little soft. I knew what I was doing. I stood there holding the pot for a moment, aware of exactly what I was doing, and I did it anyway. It was petty. I'm aware. I was 32 weeks pregnant and scared, and I needed to control something I could actually reach. Survival isn't always dignified. Sometimes it's watering a plant just enough to watch it struggle, because it's the only power you have left. After that, I sat back down at the table and opened the notebook to a fresh page and started drafting a timeline from memory, every incident I could verify and date, going back 18 months. By midnight, I had 6 pages. It was the best I had felt in weeks, which tells you something about what the previous weeks had been like. The 33-week appointment was on a Thursday morning. I go to a midwife practice, 3 women who rotate, and the one I saw that day is the one I trust most. She has a way of asking questions that makes it clear she already suspects the answer and just needs you to confirm it. She took my blood pressure twice, looked at the numbers, and asked directly, "What's your stress level at home right now?" I did not perform fine. I have performed fine at many appointments over the past several months, and I was tired of it. And my blood pressure was sitting at a number that made her face do something specific, so I told her. In clinical and factual terms, the way I describe a client's situation at a case review. There was an incident at my home 2 weeks ago involving a family member and a knife. I have filed a police report. The family member still has access to my home. My husband is not currently supporting efforts to restrict that access. She wrote while I talked. She did not look shocked, which I appreciated. Shocked would have made me feel like a spectacle. She handed me a card for a DV advocacy organization when I was done and told me she was noting the reported incident and its effect on my vitals in my prenatal file. I thanked her. I put the card in my wallet behind my insurance card, and I have not moved it since. The ride home was quiet. I sat at a red light and thought about the specific shape of the problem. I was 33 weeks pregnant. I was probably fewer than 7 weeks from a baby being in my house. Dolores had a key, and Craig had not asked for it back, and nothing I had said had moved him toward asking for it back. I had documentation, I had an attorney, I had a recording and a police report, and a 6-page timeline. None of it meant anything until I used it, and using it meant putting Craig in a room and making him hear it in a form he couldn't reframe. That evening I told Craig about the blood pressure. Plainly, no performance. I told him my midwife was concerned and had noted it in the file. He said I should try prenatal yoga. He said maybe things would settle if we gave them a little more time. I wrote that down when he went to the bathroom. Exact words, date, time. Then I went to the kitchen and I stood at the windowsill for a minute. The rosemary was already looking slightly less vivid than it should, the leaves a little soft, and I thought about the attorney's question 3 weeks earlier. Are you prepared for what this starts? I thought I had a better answer now. I went back to the bedroom and I sent her an email. I said I needed everything I had organized and ready to present within 14 days, and I needed her to arrange the meeting with the mediator. I said I was ready. She replied within the hour. I'll arrange it. Bring the binder. I hadn't told her about the binder yet. She just knew. I slept better that night than I had in 3 weeks, which surprised me, because nothing had actually changed yet. But I had set a date, and having a date is different from having a plan. A plan you can talk yourself out of. A date just arrives. Over the following 10 days, I built the binder. 2 copies, printed, tabbed, chronological. I am good at this in a way that is not glamorous. It is the same skill I use to manage care logs and medication schedules and county paperwork for people who can no longer manage their own records, and applying it to my own life felt both natural and faintly surreal, like using a work tool in a room it wasn't designed for. Tab 1, the incident log. 23 separate entries dated with photographs where I had them and exact quotes where I didn't. Tab 2, the police report number and my written account from the night of the shower. Tab 3, The nursery recording, transcribed in full with a note that the audio file was available. Tab 4. The email thread. The Put Me First exchange, printed with headers showing the date and the addresses and the point at which I was removed from the CC line. Tab 5. The note from the bedside drawer, photographed in place, with the date I found it and the date of Dolores's most recent Tuesday visit prior. Tab 6. The prenatal file notation from my midwife, the blood pressure numbers, the date. Tab 7. The scripted apology text, screenshotted, alongside Craig's message presenting it as resolution. I made the tabs myself with a label maker I'd bought for client files. I worked at the kitchen table in the evenings after Craig went to sleep. He didn't ask what I was doing. I'm not sure what I would have said. People ask why you don't just leave. I've been thinking about how to answer that, because I've heard it enough times in the past few weeks from people who mean well, from people who don't, from a voice in my own head at 2 a.m. What they mean usually is, why didn't you leave faster, smarter, cleaner, with less collateral? But when you're 33 weeks pregnant and your husband keeps telling you you're overreacting and your own mother thinks she was protecting you by holding your arms, where exactly is the door you're supposed to walk through? There isn't a clean door. There is a series of rooms, each of which requires you to be more certain than you currently feel, and the whole time you're moving through them, someone is telling you that you're being dramatic, that she didn't make contact, that what you need is prenatal yoga. I'm not saying this to make myself sound trapped. I'm saying it because I was 33 weeks pregnant and I was handling it, just not on the timeline other people would have preferred. I wasn't building a case to win. I was building a record so that no one could ever tell me I imagined it. The night before the meeting, I called Craig and asked him to come to the attorney's office with me. I said I needed to discuss the house and arrangements for when the baby came. Both of those things were true. He said yes without hesitation, which told me he still didn't understand what room he'd agreed to walk into. I said I'd see him there. I put the phone down and looked at the 2 copies of the binder sitting on the kitchen table, and then I went to bed and slept 6 hours straight, which was the most I'd slept at once in a month. The attorney's office has a round table, which I noticed when I walked in and was glad about. A round table means no one is at the head of it. My attorney was already seated. The mediator, a woman I hadn't met before, calm in the specific way of someone whose job is to stay calm while other people aren't, was to her left. I had gotten there 20 minutes early and sat in my car in the parking garage and eaten a granola bar and looked at nothing in particular. Craig arrived 2 minutes before the hour, which is how he always arrives to things, and he kissed me on the cheek when he came in, which is how I knew he still didn't understand what kind of meeting this was. He looked around the room, and something shifted slightly in his expression. The mediator, probably, or the copies of the binder already sitting at 2 seats. But he sat down and straightened his jacket and tried to get ahead of it. He said he was glad we were doing this. He said his mother had now been to therapy 3 times, that she'd started last week, that he really felt like she was taking things seriously. He said the word healing once. I let him finish. My hands were flat on the table. My attorney thanked him for sharing that, and then she opened her copy of the binder to the first tab, and she slid the second copy across the table to Craig. He looked at the cover page. It had a title and a date range 18 months, typed plainly, and his name and Dolores's name and my name, and the words incident documentation. I watched his face. It moved through several things in the space of about 10 seconds. Confusion first, then something that looked like recognition, then a particular kind of stillness that I think was understanding arriving and not being welcome. He said, "Maya, you could have talked to me about all of this." I had prepared for this sentence. I'd known it was coming the way you know certain things are coming when you've been paying close attention to a person for 4 years. I said quietly, "I did. I have the dates and what you said in response. It's in tab 4. He looked down at the binder. He put his hand on it, but didn't open it. My attorney said she was going to read through the incident log, and she'd like him to follow along, and if he had questions, she'd ask him to hold them until she finished. He nodded. She began. The first entry was from 16 months prior, a Tuesday visit, kitchen rearranged, rosemary plant moved, Craig's exact words when told, "Better light, probably." She read it in a neutral tone, the date and the description and the quote. Then she moved to the next entry. I watched Craig listen. I had no speech prepared. I had decided months ago, somewhere around the time I started the binder, that the document was the speech. That anything I added in that room would give him something to argue with, some tone to react to, some word choice to pick apart. The binder gave him nothing to argue with. It just sat there and was accurate. I did not perform anger. I did not cry. I sat with my hands flat on the table and I let 18 months speak in a neutral voice from a round table that belonged to no one. And I watched my husband hold a binder he hadn't opened yet and begin to understand what room he was actually in. My attorney picked up her phone and placed it in the center of the table and pressed play. 2 minutes and 14 seconds. I know the length because I have listened to it enough times that it is in my body the way certain things get in your body, not memorized exactly. Just present. Dolores's voice came out of the phone at medium volume, clear enough that every word was audible, and I watched Craig's face while he listened to his mother smooth a blanket over a crib in a room she had rearranged and say, "There you go, sweetheart," to a baby that wasn't born yet, and then quieter, "My baby's room." He didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He sat very still with his hands on the binder he still hadn't opened, and he listened to the full 2 minutes and 14 seconds, including the part where Dolores explains that the baby will be her second chance, including the part where she describes me, without using my name, as the thing that changed. When it ended, the room was quiet. I had planned not to fill that silence, and I didn't. I looked at the surface of the table. The mediator looked at the middle distance. My attorney looked at Craig. Craig looked at the phone for a long moment, and then he said, "I didn't know she was doing that." His voice was careful in the way of someone who is trying not to let it do something else. I said, "That's in the file too. The dates I told you things and what you said in response." I wasn't being cruel. I was being accurate, which I understand can feel the same from the receiving end. He opened the binder, then tab 4, which he found without being directed to it, which told me he'd been reading the tab labels while the recording played. He read for a few minutes. Nobody spoke. Then he closed it. He asked the mediator quietly what he was being asked to do. She explained the household access agreement Dolores's key returned through the attorney by end of week, an interim separation of living arrangement, Craig staying at his brother's for the remainder of the pregnancy and the first weeks after the birth, unless I invited him back. She said the protective order would be filed separately that afternoon regardless. He looked at me. I don't know what he was looking for. I kept my face still. He picked up the pen and he signed. We were out of the office by 11:40. I walked to my car in the parking garage. I got in. I put both hands on the wheel. I had spent weeks imagining this moment on bad nights, the turn, the proof landing, Craig finally hearing it in a form he couldn't talk around. I had imagined I would feel something large. What I actually felt was the size of a glass of water. Tired. A little hollowed out. Something that was almost sad when I thought about the look on Craig's face in the moment before he picked up the pen, not the face of someone who had known and chosen badly, but the face of someone who was only now, in that room, understanding the full shape of what he'd allowed. I didn't cry in the parking garage. I sat there for 10 minutes with my hands on the wheel and thought about nothing specific. Then I sent my mother one sentence. The protective order is filed. I'd like you to call when you're ready to have a different conversation than last time. I didn't wait for a reply. I drove home. I had a locksmith coming at 2. The house is quieter than I expected. Not peaceful, exactly, just quiet in a way that takes getting used to, the way your ears adjust after a long, loud event. Craig's jacket isn't on the hook by the door. The yogurt he likes, the expensive kind with the fruit on the bottom, stopped appearing in the fridge when he left, and I keep noticing its absence when I open the door, which is the kind of thing nobody warns you about. The first few days I walked through the rooms slowly, checking things without meaning to the nursery, the bedside drawer, the kitchen windowsill the way you check a wound to see if it's still there. It was all still there. It was just mine again. My mother called 4 days after the locks were changed. I let it ring twice before I answered, not as a power move, just because I needed 2 rings to decide I was ready. The conversation was not a resolution. She apologized partially, genuinely in some places, defensively in others, circling back to the split-second decision framework she'd built around what she'd done. I didn't perform forgiveness I don't have. I told her I believed she thought she was helping, and that I wasn't closing the door, and that I needed more time than she probably wanted me to need. She said she understood. I'm not sure she did entirely, but she said it, and we made a plan to talk again in 2 weeks, and that was enough for now while not being enough. And I know both of those things at once, and I'm not trying to resolve them into one thing. Craig sent 2 texts in the first week. I read them both. They were careful and sad and written by someone trying to find the right words for something there aren't right words for. I didn't respond. My attorney had advised minimal direct contact, and I was grateful for the professional reason to do what I already wanted, which was to not yet be in a conversation I didn't know how to have. What I feel when I think about Craig is not anger mostly. It's closer to grief for the version of things I thought we were building, which existed in some form, just not enough of a form when it mattered. I don't know what the marriage looks like from here. I genuinely don't. That uncertainty sits in the middle of my chest like something I'm carrying rather than something that will resolve on its own, and I've stopped waiting for it to lighten. 8 days after the locks were changed, I was standing at the kitchen sink on a Tuesday morning out of habit. I noticed it was Tuesday, and I looked at the windowsill. I had moved the rosemary back to the east window, the night the locksmith left, back to the spot I'd put it 18 months ago. I hadn't watered it properly in weeks, between the deliberate underwatering and everything else, and it was looking a little rough, the stems woody, the leaves dull. I filled a glass with water and poured it through slowly. Enough this time. Actually enough. I pinched off a small woody stem the way you're supposed to, and rubbed the leaf between my fingers, and the smell came up sharp and clean and familiar. I stood there for a while. In 6 weeks or so, give or take, there will be a baby in this house. I don't know what the rest of my marriage will look like by then. I know the door has a new lock, and I am the only person who holds the key, and the rosemary is going to be fine. I have a prenatal appointment this afternoon, and my friend from my old job is coming with me, she offered, and I said yes, which is something I'm practicing, saying yes when people offer. I packed the hospital bag last weekend, and in the side pocket next to my insurance cards, I put the business card from the DV Advocacy Organization. Not because I think I'll need it. Because I'm the kind of person who keeps receipts, and receipts are for the future as much as the past. What would you do in this situation? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more daily stories.
Now, here's my opinion on this story. Guys, let's analyze this story because I was truly impressed by this woman's efficiency. Honestly, the protagonist was brilliant, a real strategist. The mother-in-law stabbing the cake 47 times belongs in a psychiatric ward, but the husband witnessing it all and acting like it was nothing. Unacceptable. The guy was a complete coward. If I were in her shoes, I wouldn't have waited that long gathering evidence. The very first time they invaded my privacy and moved my plant without permission, his bags would already be out on the street. There is zero negotiation with that kind of disrespect. But the way she built that binder documenting every single detail was simply perfect. She acted with pure logic and guaranteed her own safety flawlessly. And what about you guys? Tell me down here in the comments. From which city or country are you watching this video? And what time is it on your clock right now? Also comment if you liked today's story and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos.